In the cold and crowded streets of Detroit, Michigan, a small 8-year-old boy named Lucas started every single day the same way. He woke up before sunrise under an old broken bridge, with nothing but a thin, torn blanket and the sound of passing cars above his head. His tiny hands were always cold. His shoes had holes so big that his feet touched the wet ground in the rain. But every single morning, without fail, Lucas stood up, dusted off his old clothes, and walked into the city with the same quiet look on his face. If you are new here, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that will touch your heart and move your soul. Nobody in the city paid attention to Lucas. People rushed past him on their way to work, carrying hot coffees and talking on their phones, never once stopping to look down at the small boy standing just a few feet away. Mothers pulled their children closer when they saw him. Street vendors shooed him away from their carts. Even the stray dogs near the market got more food thrown their way than Lucas ever did. He was just there every day, invisible to everyone around him, a tiny figure lost in the noise and movement of a city that never slowed down for him. Lucas had one small job that kept him going. Every morning he collected old newspapers that people had thrown away, stacked them neatly under his arm, and walked to a busy street corner near the downtown market, where he sold them for a few coins. On a good day, he earned just enough to buy one small bread roll to eat by afternoon. On a bad day, he ate nothing at all. But what made people stop and stare, on the rare occasions someone actually noticed him, was not his torn clothes or his dirty face. It was the fact that Lucas was always somehow smiling. Not a big loud smile, just a small, quiet, steady one, like he was carrying a secret that nobody else in the whole city knew about. High above the street, on the 32nd floor of a glass penthouse tower that overlooked all of downtown Detroit, lived a man named Vincent Hale. Vincent was 61 years old, one of the most powerful billionaires in the entire country, and completely alone. He owned companies in 5 states, had his face on the cover of business magazines every other month, and had not truly laughed in over 4 years. Every evening his assistant left his dinner on the kitchen counter, and every evening Vincent ate it, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the city below like a man searching for something he could not name. On one cold Tuesday evening, just as the sun was going down and the streets were emptying out, Vincent looked down from his window, and for the first time in years, something made him stop completely. Far below, almost too small to see clearly, a little boy was carefully folding an old newspaper and placing it over a sleeping, homeless woman on a bench to keep her warm, even though that same newspaper was probably the last one Lucas had left to sell that day. Vincent set his fork down slowly. He leaned closer to the glass, and for the very first time in a long time, he felt something move inside his chest that he had almost forgotten was still there. Vincent did not sleep that night. He stood at his window for a long time after the streets went quiet, but his mind kept going back to that one small moment he had witnessed. A boy with nothing covering a stranger with his last newspaper and then walking away without looking back, without waiting for a thank you, without even pausing. Vincent had spent his entire life surrounded by people who only gave when they knew. Someone was watching. What he had just seen was something completely different, and it unsettled him in a way he could not explain. The next morning, Vincent woke up earlier than usual. He did not check his emails. He did not call his assistant. He simply walked to the window with his coffee and looked down at the street below. And there was Lucas, already at his corner, arranging his small stack of old newspapers with careful hands, his breath making tiny clouds in the cold morning air. Vincent watched him for 20 minutes without moving. He noticed how Lucas always kept his newspapers in a neat pile, even though they were worn and crumpled. He noticed how Lucas stepped aside politely every time someone walked past him, never pushing, never begging, never holding his hand out. He just stood there quietly, offering what little he had, waiting patiently for whoever might stop. This went on for the next 4 days. Every morning, Vincent stood at his window and watched Lucas begin his day. He started to notice patterns that nobody else around Lucas seemed to care about at all. Lucas always arrived at his corner before 7 in the morning. He always saved the cleanest newspaper on top of his pile, never selling it, folding it neatly and tucking it under his arm the whole day. He walked with a slight limp on his left foot, probably from an old injury that had never been properly treated. And every single afternoon, around 2 o'clock, Lucas would stop whatever he was doing, sit down on the curb, close his eyes for exactly 1 minute, and then open them again and continue his day. Vincent found himself wondering what Lucas was thinking in that one quiet minute. It looked less like rest and more like prayer. By the 5th morning, Vincent realized something that genuinely surprised him. He had not once thought about his own company, his board meetings, or his quarterly reports during any of these mornings at the window. For the first time in years, something outside of his own controlled world had fully captured his attention, and that something was an 8-year-old boy living on the streets below who had absolutely no idea he was being watched. Vincent felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity sitting heavy in his chest. He was a man who could buy entire city blocks with a single phone call, and yet he was standing at a window, unable to stop watching a child survive on coins and cold air. On the 6th evening, something happened that made Vincent's breath catch completely. A group of older boys, teenagers, came and knocked Lucas's newspaper pile off the curb on purpose, laughing as the papers scattered across the wet street. Lucas did not cry. He did not shout back. He simply bent down slowly, picked up every single newspaper one by one, straightened them as best he could, and rebuilt his small pile without saying a single word. The teenagers walked away, still laughing. Lucas watched them go, then turned back to his corner, adjusted the papers one last time, and smiled that same small, quiet smile. Vincent put his hand flat against the cold glass of the window and stood there, without moving for a very long time. Something inside him had already made a decision, even though his mind had not caught up yet. Vincent stepped back from the window that night, and sat down in his chair for a long time without turning on a single light. The image of Lucas quietly picking up those scattered newspapers in the wet street would not leave his mind. He had seen grown men, powerful men, men with everything, fall apart over far smaller moments than that. But this child had simply bent down, picked up the pieces, and smiled. Vincent needed to understand why. He needed to know if what he was seeing was real, or if he was just projecting something onto a stranger from a safe distance 32 floors above the street. The next morning, Vincent called his assistant, a quiet and efficient man named Gerald, and gave him very specific instructions. Gerald was not to approach Lucas directly. He was not to say anything, not to introduce himself, not to explain anything at all. He was simply to walk past Lucas's corner and drop a $50 bill near the boy's feet, casually like it had fallen from his pocket by accident, and then keep walking without looking back. Vincent wanted to see what Lucas would do when he found money that nobody was claiming. It was a simple test, but Vincent knew that simple tests revealed the truest answers. Gerald did exactly as he was told. Vincent watched from his car parked half a block away, far enough that Lucas would never notice him. Gerald walked past the corner. The bill fluttered down near Lucas's old shoes, and Gerald kept walking. Lucas looked down. He saw the $50 bill lying on the ground right at his feet. He picked it up slowly and looked at it for a long moment, turning it over in his small hands like he was making sure it was real. Then he looked up and around the street in every direction, clearly trying to find whoever had dropped it. Gerald was already gone. Nobody around Lucas seemed to notice or care. What happened next made Vincent grip the steering wheel of his car so tightly his knuckles went white. Lucas held that $50 bill for exactly 30 seconds. Then he walked, not ran, walked calmly and deliberately across the street to where an elderly homeless woman named was sitting against a wall with a small cardboard sign and a paper cup with a few coins in it. Lucas crouched down in front of her, said something Vincent could not hear, and placed the entire $50 gently into her cup. The woman looked up at him with wide eyes, clearly shocked. Lucas just nodded once, stood up, and walked back to his corner like nothing had happened, picked up his newspaper stack, and continued his day. Vincent sat in that car without starting the engine for almost 15 minutes. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. He was a man who had run financial tests on companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had stress-tested entire business models before making a single move. And not one of those tests had ever affected him the way this one just did. A child who had nothing, who earned a few coins a day and ate maybe once, had held $50 in his hand for 30 seconds and given every single cent of it away to someone he felt needed it more. Vincent finally started the car, pulled slowly into traffic, and said nothing to Gerald the entire ride back. But his mind was already moving fast, turning something over and over, asking a question he was not yet ready to say out loud. Vincent did not sleep again that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling of his penthouse. That question he had been turning over in his mind, finally forming itself into actual words. Who was this child and where did he come from? A boy that young, with that kind of character, did not appear from nowhere. Something had shaped him. Someone had taught him. And Vincent needed to know who and what that was before he took another step forward. The next morning he called Gerald before sunrise and gave him a new set of instructions. He wanted everything, every detail that could be found about the boy at the corner near the downtown market. Quietly, carefully, and without drawing any attention, Gerald spent 2 full days making gentle inquiries around the neighborhood. He spoke to a few street vendors who had watched Lucas around for over a year. He spoke to the woman who ran the small soup kitchen 3 blocks away. He spoke to an older man who slept near the same bridge where Lucas woke up every morning. And piece by piece, a story began to come together that Gerald typed up and placed on Vincent's desk on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Vincent read it slowly from beginning to end without stopping once. By the time he finished, he sat back in his chair and pressed his hand over his mouth and stayed that way for a very long time. Lucas had not always been alone. Until 2 years ago, when he was just 6 years old, he had lived with his mother in a small rented room on the east side of Detroit. Her name was Elena. She had worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices at night and sorted packages at a warehouse in the early mornings, doing everything she possibly could to keep a roof over their heads and food on their small table. By every account from neighbors and people who knew her, Elena was a warm and gentle woman who loved her son with everything she had. But she had been quietly sick for a long time, a serious illness that she had no money to treat properly. She had refused to stop working even when her body was telling her to rest, because stopping meant Lucas would go without food. She pushed through every single day for him until the day she simply could not push anymore. Elena passed away in that small rented room on a cold February morning with Lucas sitting beside her holding her hand. He was 6 years old. There was no other family. No father in the picture, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles that anyone knew of. A neighbor had called the city services, but Lucas had slipped away before anyone came, terrified of being taken somewhere unknown, choosing the streets over the uncertainty of a system he did not understand. He had been surviving alone ever since. But buried near the very end of Gerald's report was one detail, a single line that one of the soup kitchen workers had remembered clearly. That hit Vincent harder than everything else he had just read. She said that Eleanor, in her final weeks, had told Lucas something that the boy had apparently never forgotten. She had told him that a person who helps others even when they have nothing is never truly poor, because kindness is the only currency that never runs out. Vincent read that line 3 times. Then he closed the folder, stood up, and walked to the window. Down below, tiny and distant, Lucas was at his corner, still smiling, still standing, and Vincent finally understood why. Vincent stood at that window for a long time after reading Gerald's report. The city moved below him the way it always did, loud and fast and completely indifferent. But for Vincent, everything felt strangely still. He had built his entire life around numbers, strategies, calculated decisions made from positions of power and control. But nothing in his carefully ordered world had prepared him for the simple and devastating truth of what Lucas had lived through. A 6-year-old boy watching his mother take her last breath, then walking out onto the streets of Detroit alone, carrying nothing except the words she had left him, and using those words every single day to be better than the world that had failed him. Vincent made a quiet decision standing at that window. He was not yet sure of the shape of it or how far it would go. But he knew one thing clearly. He was not going to keep watching from a distance much longer. What Vincent did not know was that someone else had also been watching. Not Lucas, not with any warmth or curiosity, but watching the street, watching who came and went, watching very carefully for anything that might disturb the quiet and corrupt arrangement he had built for himself over many years. His name was Arthur Doyle, and he ran a network of 3 homeless shelters across Detroit that were registered with the city as charitable organizations. On paper, Doyle was a community hero. He appeared at fundraisers, shook hands with local politicians, and gave interviews to small newspapers about his dedication to helping the city's most vulnerable people. But behind that carefully constructed image was a man who had been stealing government funding meant for homeless children for over 6 years, pocketing the money while the shelters he ran remained underfunded, understaffed, and in some cases genuinely dangerous for the children placed inside them. Doyle had a man on the street, an informant who passed along information from the neighborhood in exchange for small payments. That informant had noticed Gerald asking questions around the area over the past 2 days. He had seen Gerald speaking to vendors and soup, kitchen workers and the old man near the bridge, and he had reported everything back to Doyle that same evening. Doyle sat in his office behind his shelter on the north side and listened carefully, his fingers tapping slowly on his desk. He did not know who Gerald was yet, but he knew that someone with resources was suddenly very interested in that corner boy, and that kind of attention pointed in this direction was the one thing he could not afford. If anyone started looking closely at the children on these streets, they would eventually start looking at where the money for their care was actually going. And that was a path that led directly to Arthur Doyle. He made his move 2 days later. 3 men showed up at Lucas's corner just before noon. They were not loud about it. They did not make a scene. One of them simply walked up to Lucas's small newspaper stand, a few old crates he had arranged carefully, and kicked it apart with one slow, deliberate motion while the other 2 stood behind him watching. They told Lucas in quiet and very clear words that this corner was no longer available to him, and that if he came back, he would regret it. Then they walked away. Lucas stood in the middle of his scattered newspapers on the cold street and did not move for almost a full minute. Then he gathered what he could carry and walked away without looking back. Vincent's car was not parked on the block that morning. Gerald was not nearby. Nobody who cared was watching. And just like that, as quietly and quickly as a shadow disappearing when the light shifts, Lucas was gone from the street. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3, and when Vincent looked down from his window on the 4th morning and saw nothing but an empty corner where Lucas always stood, something cold and sharp moved through his chest that felt very much like fear. Vincent stared at that empty corner for a long time on the 4th morning. He had his coffee in his hand the way he always did, but he did not drink it. He just stood there looking down at the spot where Lucas should have been, where he had been every single morning for weeks, and the absence of that small figure felt louder than anything the city was producing below. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself the boy had probably just moved to a different corner or found something else to do. But Vincent had spent 40 years in business, reading situations accurately and something in. His gut was telling him clearly and firmly that this was not nothing. Something had happened to Lucas, and he had been sitting 32 floors above it all, watching through glass, doing absolutely nothing. He called Gerald at 7 in the morning, earlier than he had ever called him before. His voice was steady, but Gerald, who had worked for Vincent for 11 years, heard something underneath it that he had never heard there before. Urgency, real urgency. Not the sharp professional kind that came with closing a deal or managing a crisis in one of the companies, but something quieter and more personal than that. Vincent told him to go to the street immediately and find out where Lucas was. Gerald did not ask questions. He put on his coat and went. By midday, Gerald had covered 6 blocks in every direction from Lucas's corner and come back with very little. The soup kitchen worker said she had not seen Lucas in 4 days. The old man near the bridge said he had seen some men approach Lucas's stand, but had not heard what was said. A vendor across the street remembered seeing the men kick over the crates, but had looked away quickly. The way people in difficult neighborhoods learn to look away when they sense trouble. Nobody knew where Lucas had gone after that. Nobody had followed him to make sure he was safe. He had simply walked away and disappeared into the city. And the city had let him go without a second thought, the way it always did. Vincent listened to Gerald's report, standing in the middle of his office without sitting down. Then he did something that genuinely surprised Gerald and would have surprised anyone who knew. Vincent Hale. He picked up his own coat from the rack by the door, the plain dark one, not the expensive one he wore to meetings, and told Gerald to take him to the street, not to drop him off and wait, to walk with him. Gerald opened his mouth and then closed it again and simply nodded. 20 minutes later, Vincent Hale, one of the most recognized and powerful billionaires in the country, was walking slowly through the back streets of downtown Detroit with his collar turned up against the cold wind, looking into doorways and alleys and asking quiet questions to people huddled in corners, who looked up at him with wide and confused eyes. Word moved faster than Vincent expected. Within an hour of him being on the street, a young journalist spotted him near the soup kitchen, recognized his face immediately, and within minutes there were 2 camera crews following at a distance. Vincent did not stop. He did not pose or address them or wave them away. He just kept walking, kept asking, kept looking. People began to film on their phones. Someone posted a short video online with a caption asking why one of Detroit's richest men was walking the back alleys alone. The clip spread quickly, but Vincent had no idea, and would not have cared, because on the evening of that 4th day, in the doorway of an abandoned building 2.5 blocks from the bridge where Lucas slept, Gerald put his hand on Vincent's arm and pointed, and there, curled in the far corner of that cold, dark space, wrapped in a piece of old plastic sheeting, was Lucas. His eyes were open. He was not asleep. He was just lying very still and very quiet, the way small animals go still when they have learned that the world is not always safe. And pressed against his chest with both small hands, protected even in hiding, was a torn and faded photograph that Vincent immediately understood without needing to ask a single question. Gerald stepped back without being asked. He understood without a single word being exchanged that what was about to happen in that cold, dark doorway was not something that needed a witness. He walked back toward the street quietly and stood at the corner, with his hands in his pockets, keeping the camera crews at a distance, with nothing more than a firm look and a raised hand. Inside the abandoned building, the wind came through the broken walls in slow, cold streams, and the last light of the evening was fading fast through the gaps in the boards above. Vincent stood in the doorway, for a moment just looking at Lucas. The boy had not moved. He was watching Vincent with calm and steady eyes that held no panic and no excitement, just a quiet and careful stillness that felt far too old for an 8-year-old face. Vincent did not crouch down from a comfortable distance, the way people sometimes do when they approach children on the street, keeping themselves slightly above, slightly separate. He walked in, found a dry patch of ground beside Lucas, and sat down on the cold concrete floor, his coat spread out beneath him, and the cold came up through it immediately. But he did not adjust or complain. He just sat there beside the boy in the near dark, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The city hummed and rattled. Somewhere outside and in that broken building it felt very far away. Lucas looked at him for a while, and then looked back at the photograph he was holding against his chest, smoothing one corner of it, gently with his thumb, the way you touch something you are afraid of losing. Vincent spoke first. His voice came out quieter than he intended, rougher too, like something that had been sitting unused for a long time. He asked Lucas if he was hurt. Lucas shook his head once. Vincent asked if he was hungry. A small pause, then a single nod. Vincent reached into his coat pocket and found the plain bread, roll Gerald had bought him hours ago, that he had never eaten. and he held it out. Lucas looked at it for a second, then took it with both hands and ate it slowly and carefully, not rushing, not tearing at it the way a truly starving child might. Even hunger, Vincent noticed, Lucas managed with a kind of quiet dignity that made something tighten painfully in Vincent's throat. When Lucas finished, he folded the small paper wrapping neatly and set it beside him. Then he looked at Vincent again with those steady eyes and waited. Vincent looked at the photograph Lucas was holding. Even in the low light he could make out the image of a young woman with a warm smile and Lucas's same quiet eyes. He did not ask about it directly. Instead, he asked the question that had been sitting inside him since the very first evening he had watched Lucas cover that sleeping woman with a newspaper from 32 floors above. He asked Lucas why he always helped other people when he himself had nothing, why he gave away money that could have fed him, why he covered strangers with his last newspaper, why even after those men had destroyed what little he had walked away without anger. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the photograph and his thumb moved slowly across it again. Then he looked up at Vincent and said in a voice that was small but completely steady that his mother told him before. She went away that a person who keeps kindness in their heart, even when life takes everything else, is never truly empty. He said she told him that the way you treat people when you have nothing shows who you really are. And then he said something that Vincent was not prepared for at all. He said he tried to do it every day because it made him feel like she was still close to him. Vincent did not respond immediately. He could not. Something had broken open, very quietly inside his chest, and he was not ready for how wide and how deep it went. He had a son once, a boy named Daniel, who had his mother's laugh and Vincent's stubborn jaw and who had been gone for 4 years after an accident on a rainy highway that Vincent had replayed in his mind every single day since. He had never spoken about Daniel to anyone after the first year. He had buried that grief under work and decisions, and the forward motion of a life that never slowed down long enough to let him feel it fully. But sitting on the cold ground of that broken building next to this small boy who carried his mother's memory in a torn photograph pressed to his chest, every single wall Vincent had built around that loss came down at once. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in 4 years Vincent Hale cried. Not politely, not quietly. He cried the way a person cries when something that has been locked up for far too long finally finds its way out. Lucas did not look away or shift uncomfortably the way most people would have. He simply reached out his small, cold hand and placed it gently on top of Vincent's and left it there. And in that moment, in that cold and broken place, something was formed between them that no amount of money could have built, and nothing that came next would ever be able to take apart. Vincent did not sleep that night either, but this time it was different. This time he was not standing at a window watching from a distance. He was sitting at his desk with the city lights spread out below him, and his mind was moving fast and clear in a way it had not moved in years. The grief that had broken open in that cold building had not left him, but it had shifted into something else. Something with direction and purpose and edges, sharp enough to cut through every excuse and hesitation. He had been hiding behind for longer than he wanted to admit. He had spent 4 years after losing Daniel doing nothing but moving forward. Professionally, because forward motion was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming unbearable. But sitting on that concrete floor with Lucas's small hand on top of his, something had finally told him. Clearly that moving forward and actually living were not the same thing. He picked up his pen and started writing. By 3 in the morning he had filled 4 pages. By 5 he had called his lead attorney and woken him up without apology. By 6:30 Gerald had a full list of instructions waiting on his phone when he woke up. Vincent had made big moves before, had signed deals worth hundreds of millions, had restructured entire companies in a single afternoon, but what he was putting together in those early morning hours felt nothing like any of that. It felt like something he should have done a long time ago, and had simply not been ready for until a boy, with a torn photograph and his mother's words in His heart sat beside him in the dark and reminded him what actually mattered. 3 days later, Vincent called a press conference, not in his office building, not in a hotel ballroom or a corporate conference room. He held it outside on the steps of Detroit City Hall, in the cold open air, with the streets of the city visible behind him and a crowd that had gathered partly from the press invitations his team had sent and partly from the video that had been circulating online of him, walking through back alleys looking for a missing child. The crowd was large and mixed, journalists with cameras and microphones, city officials who had come out of cautious curiosity, and ordinary people from the neighborhood, who had heard something was happening and wanted to see it for themselves. Vincent stepped up without notes. He had never needed notes for anything that truly mattered to him, and this was no different. He spoke clearly and without performance. He told the crowd that Detroit had a problem that was not hidden, that anyone who walked these streets with their eyes open could see it plainly. Children living without shelter, without medical care, without anyone making sure they were safe or fed or given a single reason to believe the world had a place for them. He said he had been one of the people looking away for too long, standing at a comfortable distance, and telling himself it was not his problem to solve. He said he was done with that. Then he announced the donation, $50 million, directed immediately into a newly established city fund for homeless children in Detroit, designated specifically for the construction of proper shelters, free medical clinics, and fully funded educational programs. He named the 3 organizations that would oversee distribution and accountability. He announced a board of independent monitors who would publish full financial reports every quarter, so that every single dollar could be tracked by anyone who wanted to look. The crowd had gone very quiet while he spoke, and when the number landed, there was a long beat of stunned silence before the reaction came. A wave of noise, cameras clicking, voices rising, people turning to each other with wide eyes. But Vincent was not finished. He looked directly into the nearest camera and said there was one more thing the city needed to hear. He turned to Gerald, who was standing to his left, and gave a short nod. Gerald stepped forward and handed a thick folder to the city attorney, who was standing on the steps nearby. Vincent told the crowd that for over 6 years, a man named Arthur Doyle had been operating registered charitable shelters in Detroit while systematically stealing government funding meant for the children those shelters were supposed to protect. He said the folder contained financial records, testimony from former shelter workers, and documentation of diverted funds going back to the beginning. He said he was placing it directly into the hands of the city attorney and the relevant federal oversight office simultaneously, and that he expected action to be taken immediately and publicly. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a crowd absorbs something they were not expecting at all. Then 2 things happened almost at the same moment. Someone near the back shouted Doyle's name in a tone of pure outrage, and the city attorney opened the folder and went very still as his eyes moved down the first page. Within the hour, Arthur Doyle was contacted by authorities. By the end of the day, he was in custody. By the following morning, his name and face were on every news channel in Michigan, and the story had spread to national outlets across the country. But the moment that none of the journalists or cameras caught, the moment that happened quietly off to the side, while all of that noise was filling the air around City Hall, was Vincent stepping away from the microphone, walking to where Gerald was standing, and saying in a low voice that he needed to go back to Lucas, because everything he had just done meant nothing to him if that boy was still sitting alone in the cold, waiting to find out whether the world had finally decided he was worth showing up for. Gerald drove fast, but Vincent sat in the back seat without speaking the entire way. The press conference was still playing on the radio, analysts already discussing the donation, reporters standing outside Doyle's shelter describing the scene as investigators arrived with boxes and cameras. Vincent reached forward and turned it off. He did not need to hear any of it. The part of the morning that mattered to him had nothing to do with press conferences or corruption arrests or $50 million. It had to do with one small boy who was currently staying in a clean and warm room at a modest hotel 2 blocks from the bridge, where he used to sleep, a room Gerald had arranged 3 days ago, with strict instructions that nobody was to bother him, interview him, photograph him, or tell anyone where he was. Vincent had made sure of that. Lucas had been through enough without being turned into a headline, before he even had a chance to breathe. When Vincent arrived, Lucas was sitting on the edge of the bed in the plain, clean room with his shoes on and his hands folded in his lap, looking out the window at the street below. The torn photograph of Eleanor was on the small table beside him, propped carefully against the lamp so she was facing the room. Vincent noticed that immediately, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that he was slowly learning to breathe through rather than bury. He pulled the chair from the desk and sat down across from Lucas the same way he had sat on the cold, concrete floor a few nights ago, at the same level without positioning himself above the conversation. He told Lucas everything plainly and simply, the way Lucas himself seemed to prefer things. He told him about the donation, about the shelters and the medical care and the schools that would be built. He told him about Doyle and that the man would no longer be able to hurt anyone. He watched Lucas's face as he spoke and saw the boy absorb each piece of information quietly and carefully, the way he seemed to absorb everything, without rushing to react, without performing a response. When Vincent finished, Lucas looked at the photograph on the table for a moment and then back at Vincent with those steady eyes and said that was good. Just that was good. And somehow those 2 plain words from this particular child landed with more weight than any applause or press reaction. Vincent had experienced that morning. Then Vincent leaned forward slightly and told Lucas that he wanted to talk about him specifically. He told him there was a home available, a proper house in a safe and quiet neighborhood in Detroit with a room. That would be his own, with a bed and warm food every day and a school nearby that already had a place ready for him whenever he was prepared to start. He told him there were people who would be there to look after him properly, not strangers, people Gerald had personally vetted, warm and steady people who understood that Lucas was not a project or a charity case, but a child who deserved consistency and care, and space to simply be 8 years old for a while. Lucas listened to all of it without interrupting. When Vincent finished, there was a long pause. Lucas looked at the window, then at the photograph, then back at Vincent. And then he said something that stopped Vincent completely and would later, when Gerald quietly shared it with a single journalist he trusted, stop a very large part of the world as well. Lucas said he would go to the house. He said he was grateful and he meant it. But he asked first, in a voice that was gentle and completely serious, whether the other children, the ones still sleeping under bridges and in doorways and in cold, abandoned buildings across Detroit, whether they would have somewhere warm to go before winter came. He said he had friends on those streets. He named 2 of them, a boy of 7 named Theo and a girl of 9 named Cara, who slept near the East Side Market. He said he did not want to be inside somewhere warm, while they were still outside in the cold. He said if it was possible he would like to know they were taken care of first. Vincent stared at him. He had genuinely not anticipated this. In all his years of negotiating and reading people, he had never once sat across from someone and felt so completely outmaneuvered by pure and uncalculated goodness. He told Lucas yes. He told him that was already being worked on and that Theo and Cara and every other child in that situation in Detroit was exactly who the fund was designed for. Lucas nodded slowly like he was making sure he believed it and had decided that he did. Then he reached over, picked up Elena's photograph from beside the lamp, held it for a moment and placed it carefully into the front pocket of his shirt, close to his chest, the way he always carried it. And he looked at Vincent and said he was ready. Gerald was in the hallway when Vincent came out. He looked at Vincent's face and did not ask what had happened inside the room, because the answer was written across it clearly enough. But that evening Gerald made one quiet phone call to a journalist he had known for 12 years, a woman with a reputation for telling stories honestly and without sensationalism, and he told her only this much, that a child who had nothing had just been offered everything, and his first response had been to ask whether his friends were taken care of. The journalist was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then she said she would handle it carefully. The story went online at 11 that night. By morning it had been shared across platforms in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia and South Africa. By afternoon the donation lines for Detroit's new children's fund had more volume than the administrators knew how to process. And somewhere in all of that noise, an 8-year-old boy named Lucas was sitting in a warm room with his mother's photograph in his shirt pocket, sleeping for the first time in 2 years, without the cold ground beneath him or the open sky above him, resting in the quiet and certain knowledge that he had kept his mother's promise one more time. 3 months passed. Detroit changed in ways that people who lived there said they had never seen before. Not in their lifetimes, not in the lifetimes of their parents. Construction began on 4 new children's shelters across the city, proper buildings, with warm rooms and real beds and kitchens that ran 3 meals a day. The free medical clinic on the east side opened 6 weeks ahead of schedule, because donations had come in so far beyond the original target that there was enough to accelerate everything simultaneously. Theo, the 7-year-old boy Lucas had named in that quiet hotel room, was placed with a foster family in a safe neighborhood within 2 weeks of that conversation. Cara, the 9-year-old girl from the East Side Market, was enrolled in school by the end of the same month, and her teacher later told Gerald in passing that Cara had arrived on her first day with a small handwritten note tucked into her pocket that said, "Be kind, even when it is hard," signed simply with the letter L. Lucas had settled into the house Gerald had arranged for him. It was not a mansion. It was a plain and comfortable home on a quiet street with a small yard and a kitchen that always smelled like something warm. The couple looking after him, a retired school teacher named Margaret and her husband, Roy, who had spent 30 years as a youth counselor, had understood from the very first day that Lucas did not need to be fixed or rescued, or constantly reminded of how his life had changed. He just needed steadiness. He needed someone to be there in the morning when he woke up and there in the evening when the day ended. Margaret later said that in the first week, Lucas had woken up before sunrise, every single day out of habit, gotten dressed and come quietly downstairs as if preparing to go to his corner. She had simply started waking up early too, and having breakfast ready when he came down, without making a point of it or drawing attention to it, just making sure he was not alone in those early hours while his body and his mind slowly learned that the emergency was over. Vincent visited twice a week. He never arrived with cameras or assistants or any kind of announcement. He came in Gerald's plain car, knocked on the door like any ordinary visitor, and spent time with Lucas the way you spend time with someone whose company you have come to genuinely need. They played chess badly on both sides. They watched nature, documentaries that Lucas had developed an unexpected passion for. Sometimes they just sat in the small yard, when the weather allowed, and did not talk very much at all. Margaret told her sister in a private letter that she had never seen 2 people so different in age and background and circumstance fit together so naturally and so quietly. She said it was like watching 2 people who had both been very alone for a very long time simply decide, without any words, that they did not have to be anymore. The twist came on a cold morning in early spring, on the day of the opening ceremony for the first completed shelter. It was called a community center officially, a place not just for sleeping but for learning and medical care and after school programs and everything else that the children of Detroit's streets had been going without for far too long. Vincent had overseen every detail of the construction, but there was one element of the opening day that he had arranged entirely alone, without telling Gerald, without telling Margaret or Roy, without telling anyone except the small crew, who had carried out the work on his specific instruction 3 days before the ceremony. The building was full when Lucas arrived with Margaret and Roy. City officials were there, community leaders, journalists, dozens of children who were already registered to use the facility and their caregivers, and a crowd of ordinary Detroit residents who had come because this place belonged to all of them, and they wanted to be present for the beginning of it. Lucas walked in quietly in his plain clothes, the photograph in his shirt pocket the way it always was, and stood near the back while people around him buzzed with conversation and the kind of energy that fills a room. When something that was promised has actually been delivered, Vincent stepped to the front and spoke briefly. He thanked the city. He thanked the teams who had built the facility ahead of schedule. He said that everything in this building existed because a child had reminded a man who thought he had seen everything that the most powerful thing in the world was not money or influence or position, but the decision to keep your heart open when life gave you every reason to close it. He did not say Lucas's name. He did not point to him or draw the crowd's attention toward him. He had promised Lucas that, and he kept it. Then Vincent said there was one final thing before the doors officially opened. He nodded to someone near the far wall. The lights in the main hall dimmed slightly, and a large curtain that had been covering the entire length of the entrance wall was slowly pulled back, and what it revealed made the room go completely and absolutely silent. It was a mural, floor to ceiling, stretching the full width of the entrance wall, painted in warm and careful detail by an artist Vincent had commissioned in secret. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a steady smile, painted so beautifully and so accurately from the single torn photograph that Lucas had carried against his chest for 2 years that there was no question who she was. She was surrounded by children, many children, all different ages and faces, and above her in clean, simple letters were the words she had spoken to her son in a small rented room on the east side of Detroit before she left him, the words he had carried with him through every cold night and every hungry morning and every moment when the world had made it very clear that it was not going to make things easy for him. A person who helps others even when they have nothing is never truly poor, because kindness is the only currency that never runs out. At the bottom of the mural in smaller letters it read, "Dedicated to Elena, who taught her son everything that mattered, and through him taught the rest of us too." Lucas stood at the back of that room and did not move for a long time. The crowd around him had begun to react, quietly at first, people leaning toward each other, a hand going to a mouth here, someone reaching for a tissue there, and then the sound of the room shifted into something that was not quite crying and not quite applause, but something in between, a collective release of feeling that moved through every person standing in that space. Margaret put her hand gently on Lucas's shoulder. Roy stood close on his other side. Lucas looked at the mural for a very long time. He looked at his mother's painted face, at her eyes that the artist had captured with a warmth and accuracy that made it feel less like paint and more like presence. His hand moved to his shirt pocket and rested there over the photograph. Then Lucas did something that nobody in that room expected, and that every single person who witnessed it would describe in the same way when they spoke about it afterward. He walked forward through the crowd, which parted for him naturally and quietly without anyone directing it, and he walked all the way to the wall and stood directly in front of the mural and placed his small hand flat against it, against his mother's painted image, the same way Vincent had once pressed his hand against the cold glass of his penthouse window, looking down at a boy the city had decided not to see. He stood there with his hand on the wall and his eyes closed for exactly 1 minute, the same one quiet minute he had taken every afternoon at his corner when he was alone on the street, and the entire room held its breath with him. When he opened his eyes, he turned around and looked at the crowd and at Vincent standing near the front, and his face held that same expression it had always held, that small and steady and undefeated quiet, except that now it was not the expression of a child holding himself together in a world that had abandoned him. It was the expression of a child who understood fully and completely that his mother's words had traveled from that small room through him and out into the city and all the way up these walls, and that she had kept her promise to him just as faithfully as he had kept his to her. He said nothing. He did not need to. Vincent stood in the middle of that room with tears running down his face and did not try to stop them or hide them, and around him the whole city cried with him. Rich and poor and young and old, every person in that room undone by the same simple and enormous truth that an 8-year-old boy with nothing had understood all along. That kindness given freely always finds its way home. If you made it to the end of this story, drop a one word in the comments that describes how you feel right now. And tell us, do you think Vincent would have changed if he had never seen Lucas that first evening at the window? Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that will move your heart like this one did.